Parents of the girls kidnapped in Nigeria's northwest state of Zamfara are left picking up the pieces of the void left by their absence of their daughters. Balarabe Kagara, the father of two 14-year-old girls kidnapped on Friday, is still coming to terms with the ordeal.
54-year-old Kagara is left distraught but hopeful that his daughters will be found and rescued.
I will be very happy if I see my daughters, and I believe that if they see me too, they will be happy. We will all be happy.
An operation to rescue the girls has failed to pinpoint their location. Almost 48 hours after the gunmen seized the girls at a school in Zamfara, no word or clue has come to the fore. The governor of Zamfara ordered all the boarding schools to close immediately after the kidnapping. Kagara, a farmer who left the hinterlands of the city of Zamfara in pursuit of a better education for his children, said that sending his children back to school depended on whether there was improved security.
I am not speaking for anyone, but if there is enough security, I believe people will return their children to school.
School kidnappings were first carried out by Boko Haram and Islamic State. The tactic has now been adopted by other militants whose agenda is unclear. The kidnappings have become endemic around the increasingly lawless north, to the anguish of families and frustration of Nigeria's government and armed forces. Meanwhile, leader of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Francis, on Sunday prayed for the release of the girls during Mass. The Pope prayed for the Nigerian clergy to strongly condemn those behind the kidnappings.
Unisco la mia voce.
I join my voice to those of the bishops of Nigeria to condemn the cowardly kidnapping of 317 girls taken away from their school.
Friday's kidnapping was the third such incident since December. Officials say the rise in abductions is fueled in part by sizable government payoffs in exchange for child hostages, catalyzing a broader breakdown of security in the north.
For more on the situation in Nigeria and other main stories on the continent this month, I'm joined by the head of Africa Peace and Security Governance Program at the Institute for Security Studies, Dr Andrews Atta-Asamoah. Dr Atta-Asamoah, very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, let's start in Niger. Mohamed Bazoum has been elected president after a runoff, but opposition has declared himself the winner, and as expected, violence has followed. This appears to be a common path in many African countries after elections. Are we perhaps, as a continent, failing to uphold and deepen democracy by failing to hold fair and credible elections, or accepting results when they don't go our way?
I think it's a mix of many of the issues you've raised. First of all, I think that what we need to do at this particular point is to have a very frank conversation about the rising trend of populism and the sense that a lot of opposition candidates promise so much, to their followers, and when it doesn't go in their favor, then they are forced to either say the elections were stolen or something. But in that case, we also need to look at the level of transparency of the elections itself, so that the whole process doesn't get contested afterwards. So in many ways, it raises questions about the nature of the elections that we are having, the extent of transparency, but also the rise of populism, which puts a lot of pressure on opposition candidates, by the way. We've seen it across the continent, that sometimes after the elections are declared and the opposition has lost, even though they may not have all the variables to go to court or to prove that it was stolen, they still have to insist, because that is what they kept drumming into the ears of their opponent, their followers.
Now, the former President Issoufou's decision not to run for a third term in line with the country's constitution, do you think that was a sign of a healthy democracy?
Precisely, that was. But I think that as much as him stepping away needs to be praised, we just don't need to measure the maturity of democracies on the continent just by elections. I think it takes more than that. In cases where we've done that, we've ended up in a situation where the the elections themselves fail, and then you find that below that were rots that needed to be responded to. So what we need to do is to praise it when it needs to be done, when a particular leader leaves power at the right time, but go beyond that to know that democratic maturation goes beyond just elections. We need to have conversations about the structures of the state and how they are maturing, the institutions are maturing in themselves, because that is the only way to sustain the little gains we make. If we measure democracy just by the elections, sometimes you end up realizing that when things begin to unravel, there will be so much of rot that we would have neglected behind the scenes.
All right, let's go to Uganda now, where Bobi Wine seems to have run out of options after withdrawing the challenge to the January elections results, while the United States has called for election results audit. So what's next for Bobi Wine?
I think the good thing that he has on his hands is what he said some time ago, to say that he represents the future. I think the young man, as when we first had our conversation some time ago between you and I said that whatever happens, he's registered a very tough opposition. And for now, I wish that he should have gone ahead with the court case, because whether it's ruled in your favor or not, you provide a basis for testing the system and also the documentation of the kind of evidence you had. Now that is withdrawn, he's now left with sustaining the kind of support that he had. So going forward, his strength will have to be sustaining the voices that stood with him, sustaining his support base, and then looking ahead to see whether if he in the future can still come back as a strong candidate that he is. There are every indication that Bobi Wine as a variable in the politics of Uganda is not going to end anytime soon. And so, as I said, he's a young man, so time is his biggest advantage on his hands at the moment.
He may have lost the elections, but he certainly has won growing power and influence and, of course, affection. But how will that help him in the medium to long term?
I think it depends on whether he will stay on as the face of the opposition in the country. That is important. That is necessary, because since Besigye really left the scene, we haven't seen a very strong opposition as he has. And as I indicated, what is left is for him first to sustain the base. That is going to be a very difficult thing to do, because time erodes political popularity. But the last election really points to the fact that quite a sizable population in Uganda are not necessarily supporting the ruling president. So what that means is that he has to find a way to sustain that, win more, and hope that the system has become fair to him in his next election. That is not going to be easy, but he has to sustain himself as a relevant force in the politics of the country.
Well, the fact that his party will lead the influential oversight committees in parliament that were long dominated by an opposition group led by Kizza Besigye, will this perhaps give him some sort of, the leeway to win the hearts of many Ugandans?
Not much, because, it depends on how he's able to plug whatever he's able to achieve in that domain to the broader conversation in the country about the politics. And, he's fighting against a system. President Museveni has been there for a long time. He literally represents, his nature represents the very structures and institutions the country has. And so having a position like that will not necessarily give him an opportunity to offset the robust nature of the force he's fighting against. But I think that if he is able to chalk some successes and project himself as someone who is capable of delivering, then his appeal can be grounded on substance rather than just looking for an alternative to President Museveni.
In Ethiopia, the war in the Tigray region looks likely to be a protracted one, with allegations of a massacre last year while the country is headed for national elections in June Has this war plunged the country into potential long-term instability, or can Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed succeed in unifying a clearly polarized society?
The first thing it shows is that, first of all, we all were very excited when he came, the man of peace and all of that. I think, first of all, that appeal has really been challenged. But the war itself brings up the different layers of challenges that he is dealing with, both domestically and in the region. And so this is a major one. He declared it over, but there's every indication that it's going to protract for a while. So he's going to be able to keep it together, but it depends on how he managed this very thorny situation. My fear is whether it will change him into someone else. We've seen that happen across the continent in many ways, where situations at home and the challenges and the questions it poses to a particular leader forces him to change the way he rules. I think Ethiopians might not be ready for that, because he was welcomed, he was popular, because they saw him as a peace builder. This is one test for him to cement that perception about him. If he fails, then everything in the country, the reform he sold to the people, everything will begin to unravel. I'm really wishing him all the best, but it's become a very complex situation for him to handle. There are many layers of it, many pulling parts. If he fails at this, the challenges will be very, very difficult to contain in the country.
And what should the Biden administration, as one of the allies of Ethiopia, do insofar as the restoration of peace there?
I think for every conflict you have very many sides and issues that inform the positions and interests of the various groups. I think we need a very strong mediator coming in. The African Union tried to do something like that. The Ethiopian government were not kind to that. And so far, I think we need someone who can be listened to by the Ethiopian leadership, as well as the forces on the ground, on both sides, so that they can come to the table and begin to talk in a way that puts Ethiopia as a country first. At the moment, they are pulling in different directions, and what that means is that both sides are cementing the challenges of the country, and they are making the country more and more vulnerable. Ethiopia is a very big country, a strategic country, and a country that holds the Horn of Africa together in many dimensions. If they don't put the stability of Ethiopia first, and the country goes down, it's not going to go down alone. It's going to go down with the entire region. And as we know, the Horn of Africa is already a very fragile situation. And so Ethiopia needs to play that holding force it's always been. And so for America being an ally, bringing all of this into context and making it a very important subject in the discussions with all the different sides will actually elevate the situation for them to start thinking beyond themselves and the issues on the table, to be more regional and to now think about the future and the fact that the sustainability of the country is at stake if they are not able to keep this particular situation resolved in time.
And we've heard, so much noise from the United Nations bodies about the dire situation in the Tigray region. But why does it seem that, the continental bodies, the regional and the continental bodies, such as the African Union, are seemingly helpless in dealing with the conflict in the Tigray region?
It's a complex one. On one side, you have the African Union very willing. They offered to do a bit of mediation in this, but then the Ethiopian government, they didn't get that kind of reception. The difficulty with such situations is that the regional and continental organizations are relevant to the extent that they are allowed by the country in question to come in to play a role. When the country in question says, I am in charge, this is a domestic issue, then it becomes a conflict between your multilateral responsibilities on one side and the imperatives of sovereignty, or what the dictates of sovereignty. In that sense, you can't force your way through, because multilateral roles are hinged on the respect of the recipient country. And in this particular case, Ethiopia continues to insist that this is a domestic situation and they are in charge. That makes it difficult. The African Union, IGAD, and all the actors cannot just go in. They need to be received by the host country. That is where the challenge is. But we are increasingly seeing a situation where multilateral actors wish to be able to do more, but then you are limited by respect for sovereignty, because that is the foundation of the international system. That really is one dimension that this situation is playing out and raising questions about the commitment that some of our countries the kind of commitment they roll out for the respect of the role of international organizations. One of the things that we all need to realize is that once the conflict begins to spill over, it then becomes natural for the host country to respect the role of regional and continental actors, because in that sense, it becomes more of an international issue. And this Ethiopian case is one particular case we have all these variables playing out.
And on to Nigeria now, where abductions and kidnappings seem to be a regular occurrence following the abduction of over 300 girls this past week. So the big question then, Doctor, is the political will lacking from the part of government to deal with armed groups, or is the problem perhaps just too big to expect the state to tackle on its own?
I will go for the second answer you provided. The situation is so big. And so it's multifaceted. If you look at now the rise in kidnapping, it's not just about the existing insecurity on the ground. There's an element of profiteering. There's an element of extreme vulnerability of these schools. And the fact that these armed groups have identified these schools as an extremely vulnerable point, that gives them so much attention quickly, and actually also a point to cash in terms of ransoms and all that. So the mix of criminality and insecurity and existing terrorist trends makes it extremely difficult for any government to handle. And also the fact that you can't even predict the next move. So what is required is for the governments to be proactive in beefing up securities in schools and find a way to reduce the payment of ransoms, because once you continue to free them through ransoms and all of that, you then incentivize the criminality that comes with it. And it becomes an attracting point for several groups that may not necessarily be linked to terrorism, but are actually connected to profiteering, to then find it as an avenue for raising funds to stock themselves, to create more insecurity. So the government finds itself in a very dire situation. What that means is that they need all the support they need. But again, the question of a political will you brought in, is the government rolling out all its power? Nigeria is a very capable country when they put their minds to it.
Yes.
So this is the time for the government to bring everything on the table and solve it by its roots and deal with it by all dimensions, so that Nigeria can really have the peace they need. Once you start targeting young people, the future is at stake. And that is where the danger is. And that is where the clarion call is, for the government to sit up and solve it really fast.
Now, there's this, there's another big issue affecting the judiciary, rather the attacks on the judiciary. The Pan-African Lawyers Union and the African Court Coalition this week have expressed concern over the increasing attempts to undermine judicial independence across the continent. Do you share their sentiments, Doctor, that the independence of the judiciary needs enhancing to boost democracy on the continent?
They are the pillar of, or if you like, they are the direct measure of strengthened institutions in the mind of the common person. If the person feels the judiciary is independent and they can go in there and have fair trial, it cascades into their perception of independence of every sector of government. Now, if they begin to struggle, as we are seeing in some countries, even linked to what Bobby Wine, the reason why he withdrew his case, the perception that they may not be fair and all of that, it raises questions about the kind of faith citizens are developing in these institutions. And that, down the line, has a huge implication on the kind of state we are building. If people cannot attach and trust the state, then it becomes very difficult for you to win the hearts and minds of the people to support the state, which is important, by the way, in strengthening the nature of the state. Any state that is weak at that particular point cannot rally citizens around development. And so citizens begin to do things that are in their personal favor and not in the favor of the collective. We are seeing a mix of situations where you have some perception of fairness and also some perception of attacks, if you like, by the way you put it. And so I think that we need really to look at it. The successes we've chalked in some of the countries are not enough for us to go resting to say that we've made progress. Yes. Across the continent, we really need to up our game in providing the space for the judiciary to be independent enough to be trusted by the people as a credible pillar in our democracy.
And I suppose then, in terms of upping the game, the African Union comes into play here, and especially the AU chair, which is now occupied by the DRC. Now that we have discussed some of the problems confronting the continent, how do you think President Felix Tshisekedi should go about making sure that his tenure as the chairperson of the African Union actually deals with some of these issues?
One of the key characteristics of the African Union is that the African Union is a huge norm entrepreneur, in the sense that they may not be able to enforce it all the time, but they have the moral authority to set standards, to preach standards, and to call members to respect those standards. Their weakness is that they depend on the goodwill of members to be able to implement, to make these things happen. And that is where precisely the chair of the African Union, Tshisekedi, at this particular point, has a huge role to play. I think President Ramaphosa played a huge role in our management of COVID on the continent. Now, this Tshisekedi is coming in, and he has a role now to push forward the AU's role as a respected norm entrepreneur, by what he embodies as a person, what he personifies in that role, the ability to mobilize leaders around an objective, a single objective. In this case, our governance systems, they need to push forward. This discussion we had about governance and democracy and all of that being number one, but also what is already an existential threat, the COVID pandemic, and the fact that we are getting to a stage where we need to push, forward vaccination. So all of this, he comes at a very crucial time. His role is simple: mobilize continental will, mobilize the leaders on the continent, and have them focus on what we need: governance, response to conflict, dealing with the threat of COVID, and many other things. What he has to do, however, is to avoid the temptation of covering everything at the same time. I think he needs to focus on COVID, focus on conflict, and focus on governance. These three will set him apart. But he has to then bring a certain level of stability from home to give him the credibility to be able to call for others to rally around a clarion call he will put on the table.
Dr. Andrews Atta-Asamoah, the head of Africa Peace and Security Governance Program at the Institute for Security Studies, joining us via Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.